From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The president wanted to take the shackles off individuals in these agencies and say, you have a mission, there are laws that need to be followed, you should do your mission and follow the law.
Millions of undocumented immigrants face potential deportation as the Trump administration issues sweeping new rules for the Department of Homeland Security while increasing the number of immigration and border agents by 15,000. On the campaign trail, Donald Trump called for a deportation force.
You're going to have a deportation force.
Are you going to pay for this?
It's very inexpensive.
Are they going to be ripped out of their homes?
Can I tell you? They're going back where they came. If they came from a certain country, they're going to be brought back to that country. That's the way it's supposed to be.
Are deportation forces now becoming a reality? We'll speak with a former Department of Homeland Security lawyer and the first undocumented lawyer in New York. Then, as dozens of Jewish community centers face bomb threats, President Trump has finally spoken out against the anti-Semitic attacks after facing public outcry.
The anti-Semitic threats targeting our Jewish community and community centers are horrible.
But was Trump's message too little too late? That's what the head of the Anne Frank Center here in New York says. We'll speak to him as well as the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is chronicling the rise of hate groups since Trump launched his run for the White House. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The White House is moving to greatly expand the Department of Homeland Security's authority to deport millions of undocumented immigrants and to increase the number of Immigration and Border Patrol agents by 15,000. Under the rules issued Tuesday, almost any undocumented person in the country could be detained and deported, even if they've never committed a crime. A traffic violation or mere suspicion of committing a crime could now be grounds for deportation. Any immigrant who cannot prove they've been in the United States for over 2 years could be deported without a hearing. The memos also call for the prosecution of parents who seek to reunite their family by using smugglers to bring their children into the country. According to the White House, protections will remain in place for dreamers, at least for now, immigrants who came to the United States as children and have since received permission to live and work in the United States under President Obama's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program known as DACA, although a dreamer was just arrested last week. The Trump administration's crackdown against immigration and immigrants currently living in the United States has sparked widespread protest. Only hours after the Department of Homeland Security unveiled its deportation plans, activists unfurled a 3 feet by 20 feet banner at the base of the Statue of Liberty, reading, "Refugees Welcome." Last Thursday, thousands of immigrants closed their businesses, refused to go to work, and kept their children home from school for a Day Without Immigrants protests in San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Phoenix, Chicago, Atlanta, Detroit, Raleigh, Charlotte, Austin, and other cities. Media reports now say as many as 100 immigrants lost their jobs after taking part in the protests, including construction and restaurant workers. The owner of JVS Masonry in Commerce City, Colorado, fired 30 bricklayers, even though they told their boss ahead of time that they planned to skip work to participate in the protests. We'll have more on the Department of Homeland Security memos after headlines. President Trump has spoken out against anti-Semitism after widespread criticism over his failure to condemn the waves of bomb threats against Jewish community centers and other attacks against the Jewish community since his inauguration. On Tuesday, Trump called anti-Semitism horrible and painful at the end of his tour of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C.
The anti-Semitic threats targeting our Jewish community and community centers are horrible and are painful and a very sad reminder of the work that still must be done to root out hate and prejudice and evil.
President Trump's comments came as several Jewish community centers, or JCCs, were temporarily evacuated Monday after receiving bomb threats. In total, 69 threats have been reported against 54 JCCs since inauguration. Meanwhile, a Muslim-led fundraiser has raised more than $50,000 to help repair the Jewish cemetery in University City, Missouri, where the grave sites of more than 100 Jews were vandalized over the weekend. Many are calling Trump's comments too little, too late. In a statement, the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect said, quote, "The president's sudden acknowledgement is a Band-Aid on the cancer of anti-Semitism that's infected his own administration," unquote. We'll have more on Trump's comments with the director of the Anne Frank Center, as well as Mark Potok of the Southern Poverty Law Center, later in the broadcast. In North Dakota, Lakota water protectors fighting the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline have vowed to make a treaty stand today to resist their forcible eviction from the main Oceti-Sakowin resistance camp. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the North Dakota governor have imposed a noon eviction deadline today for the hundreds of water protectors still living at the resistance camp. The government has warned that after 2 p.m., state and federal agents will begin arresting people who remain. Water protectors say the resistance camp sits on unceded Sioux territory under the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie and that they have a right to remain on their ancestral land. These are some of the Lakota women at the encampment.
I am Sichungu Lakota, and this is my treaty territory.
I am Oglala Lakota, and this is my treaty territory.
I am Ohe-Nupa Lakota, and this is my treaty territory.
But after the deadline of February 22nd, 2017, at 2 p.m.,
we are all at risk of facing arrests, police brutality, federal charges, and prison time.
Across the country, Republican lawmakers were confronted by thousands of angry constituents at town hall meetings and events Tuesday, as voters demanding the Republicans take action to challenge President Trump. Iowa Republican Senators Chuck Grassley and Joni Ernst, Florida Congressman Dennis Ross, Tennessee Republican Congressmember Marsha Blackburn, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell were all confronted by voters frustrated by Trump's policies on immigration, education, and jobs, his refusal to release his tax returns, his inclusion of white nationalists in his administration, among other issues. Some voters asked whether the lawmakers would support Trump's impeachment. This is one woman challenging Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell during a town hall meeting on Tuesday.
The last I heard, these coal jobs are not coming back, and now these people don't have the insurance they need because they're poor. And they work those coal mines, and they're sick. The veterans are sick. The veterans are broken down. They're not getting what they need. If you can answer any of that, I'll sit down and shut up like Elizabeth Warren.
The woman was referencing Senator Elizabeth Warren's reading of Coretta Scott King's 1986 letter against Jeff Sessions during a debate over his confirmation as Attorney General. Senator Warren was silenced and rebuked by Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell for reading the letter. In response to the wave of resistance against Republican lawmakers, President Trump tweeted, "The so-called angry crowds and home districts of some Republicans are actually, in numerous cases, planned out by liberal activists. Sad!" exclamation point. CIA analyst and National Security Council spokesman Edward Price has resigned over his opposition to President Trump. In an article published in the Washington Post headlined, "I didn't think I'd ever leave the CIA, but because of Trump, I quit." Price calls Trump's actions disturbing. He writes the final straw for him was watching the National Security Council be reorganized to demote and give the Trump's chief strategist and former Breitbart leader, Stephen Bannon, a full seat on the Principals Committee. This is Price.
If this administration decides to go it alone and to say, with intelligence be damned, I think there's a real consequence for escalation on any number of fronts, and an escalation that has the potential to put lives at risk.
Price was concerned about the demoting of the generals and the elevating of the former Breitbart News chief, Steve Bannon. The U.S. Supreme Court began hearing arguments Tuesday in the case of the 15-year-old Mexican teenager who was shot dead by a U.S. Border Patrol agent who fired across the border in 2010, and whether the boy's parents have the right to sue in U.S. courts, even though the bullet struck the boy in Mexico. Teenager Sergio Adrian Hernandez Guareca was playing with his friends on the Mexican side of the border that separates El Paso, Texas, from Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, when Border Patrol agent Jesus Mesa fired across the border into Mexico, killing Hernandez. The Supreme Court justices appear to be split, meaning the court may hold on to the case and reschedule a new hearing after a ninth justice is confirmed. The ruling could impact at least some of the 6 other cases where U.S. agents have killed Mexican citizens by shooting across the border. In international news, Palestinians have expressed outrage at the short sentence given to an Israeli soldier caught on tape executing a wounded Palestinian man. On Tuesday, a military panel sentenced Israeli Sergeant Elor Azaria to 18 months in prison and a demotion in rank. Video of the killing last March shows Palestinian Abdel Fattah al-Sharif lying immobilized on the ground as Azaria fires a single shot into the man's head at close range. The killing took place in Hebron in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. The father of al-Sharif said, quote, "If someone is arrested for throwing a rock, they get a 2-year sentence. In this case, a soldier murdered and got a 1.5 years. This is Wassel Abu Youssef of the Palestine Liberation Organization.
Today's sentencing for the murder of the martyr Abd al-Fattah al-Sharif, who was murdered by one of the occupation's fascist soldiers, a murder that was filmed and broadcast on most of the world's satellite channels. This deliberate murder of a wounded person who was not able to move and was shot in the head and killed in cold blood. Today, a fake court decided to hand down a light sentence to this soldier, which illustrates a disrespect of Palestinian lives and international laws.
A British Muslim school teacher is speaking out after he says he was denied entry into the United States during a school trip last week, even though Trump's travel ban had been suspended and the teacher is a British citizen who was born in Wales. Juhel Mia says he was removed from the plane at Reykjavik Airport in Iceland on February 16th.
I was in shock. I couldn't believe it was happening. It hit me the hardest when I looked back and I could see all the kids looking at me, all the members of staff, and as I was going through the plane, it felt like everyone else on the plane were looking at me as if I was a threat to them or I would harm them anyway. So I felt powerless. I felt like I'm being targeted, and I had no idea why, and there was nothing I could do.
He was taken away even though he was escorting all of his students onto the plane. Back in the United States, a federal judge has blocked Texas from defunding Planned Parenthood. Judge Sam Sparks issued an injunction in favor of the women's health care organization after Texas tried to cut off Medicaid funding for non-abortion services to Planned Parenthood. Texas had falsely and unsuccessfully accused Planned Parenthood of selling fetal tissue, drawing on heavily edited and widely discredited anti-choice videos as evidence. The ruling makes Texas the 6th state where courts have blocked efforts to defund Planned Parenthood at the state level. And while white nationalist Milo Yiannopoulos has resigned from Breitbart amidst widespread outrage over his comments appearing to endorse pedophilia. On Tuesday, Yiannopoulos announced his resignation at a news conference here in New York City.
My employer, Breitbart News, has stood by me while others caved. They've allowed me to carry conservative and libertarian ideas to communities that would otherwise never have had them. They have been a significant factor in my success, and I'm grateful for the freedom and for the friendships that I forged there. But I would be wrong to allow my poor choice of words to detract from my colleagues' important job, which is why today I'm resigning from Breitbart effective immediately.
Milo Yiannopoulos' resignation comes after Simon & Schuster canceled the publication of his book Dangerous, and the American Conservative Union rescinded an invitation to speak at the upcoming annual CPAC conference over his comments discrediting age of consent laws and promoting relationships between younger boys and older men.
This arbitrary and oppressive idea of consent, which totally destroys, the understanding that many of us have of the complexities and subtleties and complicated nature of many relationships. Some of the most important, enriching, and incredibly, life-affirming, important, shaping relationships, very often between younger boys and older men, can be hugely positive experiences for those young boys.
Milo Yiannopoulos has long faced opposition led by women of color and transgender activists over his history of making racist, sexist, and xenophobic statements. At the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, for example, he outed and mocked a transgender student showing her name and photo on screen in December. Best-selling author Roxane Gay, who canceled her book deal in January with Simon & Schuster in protest of its now-canceled deal with Yiannopoulos, wrote, quote, "As someone who endured a bit of his harassment, it's breathtaking in its scope, intensity, and cruelty," unquote. She said she will still not publish her upcoming book with Simon & Schuster, saying the publisher, quote, "should have never enabled Milo in the first place." And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The White House is moving to greatly expand the Department of Homeland Security's authority to deport millions of undocumented immigrants and to increase the number of Immigration and Border Patrol agents by 15,000. Under rules issued on Tuesday, almost any undocumented person in the country could be detained and deported even if they've never committed a crime. A traffic violation or mere suspicion of committing a crime could now be grounds for deportation. Any immigrant who cannot prove they've been in the United States for over 2 years could be deported without a hearing. Any migrant, regardless of their nationality, who crosses the southern border will be deported to Mexico while they await deportation hearings. The memos also call for the prosecution of parents who seek to reunite their family by using smugglers to bring their children into the United States. One of the memos states, quote, "With extremely limited exceptions, DHS will not exempt classes or categories of removal aliens from potential enforcement." One exception to that are the Dreamers. According to the White House, protections will remain in place for now for some immigrants who came to the United States as children without papers, as long as they don't commit any crimes. On Tuesday, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer said the president wanted to take the shackles off the nation's immigration agents.
The president needed to give guidance, especially after what they went through in the last administration, where there were so many carve-outs that ICE agents and CBP members had to figure out each individual whether or not they fit in a particular category, and they could adjudicate that case. The president wanted to take the shackles off individuals in these agencies and say, you have a mission, there are laws that need to be followed, you should do your mission and follow the law.
Many immigrant rights activists fear the memos will lead to the creation of a deportation force that President Trump talked about while running for president.
Going to have a deportation force.
Are you going to pay for this?
It's very inexpensively.
Are they going to be ripped out of their homes?
Can I tell you, they're going back where they came. If they came from a certain country, they're going to be brought back to that country. Mm-hmm. That's the way it's supposed to be.
That was Donald Trump being questioned by MSNBC's Mika Brzezinski in 2015. We're joined now by two guests. In Ann Arbor, Michigan, at the University of Michigan, we're joined by Margot Schlanger, professor of law at the University of Michigan Law School. She served in the Obama administration as the head of civil rights and civil liberties at the Department of Homeland Security. Here in New York, we're joined by Cesar Vargas, who is co-director of Dream Action Coalition. He is New York State's first openly undocumented attorney. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Cesar, your response first to what has been now presented by the Department of Homeland Security.
Well, foremost, we are seeing now a deportation force on steroids, because the fact is that the deportation force was created back, with George Bush, but also strengthened with President Obama, who deported more people than any president in American history. So Donald Trump has really taken the keys of this deportation machine and refueling it and really aggressively pursuing and targeting every immigrant. And when he talks about we're just going to go after the bad ones, after the rapists, the criminals, well, he's not targeting just those not violent criminals, but he's targeting potentially parents, hardworking children, students, and veterans who he claims to be a supporter of, champion of veterans. He is now about to deport veterans and the families of these veterans. So we're seeing Donald Trump taking the keys of an aggressive deportation machine that President Obama created and taking it in over 100 miles per hour.
Can you, Professor Margot Schlanger, talk about what you think are the critical guidelines here and what they mean for millions of immigrants in the United States?
Well, the problem is there really aren't guidelines. What the president has done and what DHS has now confirmed is rendered basically every person who's here out of status a prospect for deportation. And so it's everyone. If you read through what are supposed to be the priorities, they reach pretty much everybody. So what used to be the limits on deportation, which was a combination of prioritization and capacity, the capacity of the system to process people, he's gotten rid of the prioritization, and he's amping up capacity in a bunch of different ways. He's speeding the kinds of deportations that happen without any court process at all, and he's expanding detention massively to put people in detention while they wait for their court process. And he's talked about now, the word that he uses is surging the judicial capacity in the immigration courts, which are these kind of administrative courts. So pretty much we should expect to see anybody who's not a dreamer is now subject to the possibility of deportation, and the deportation machinery, it hasn't ramped up yet, but it's going to ramp up starting, today.
How does, Margot Schlanger, this differ from what happened under President Obama? You worked for, ultimately, President Obama. You worked at the Department of Homeland Security.
Yeah. So it's true that President Obama inherited a kind of deportation capacity of about as many as 400,000 people a year, and used that capacity for a number of years, although in the last year or two the numbers were down a lot. The difference was that the Obama administration set up specific priorities and tried to focus on people who had done something wrong in addition to being here out of status, as well as, I should say, very recent entrants, people who had only been here a few days. So what this is doing is it's describing as recent entrants people who've been here up to 2 years, which is a pretty long time, and getting rid of the focus on the people who have done something wrong. So instead of focusing, if you're doing speeding enforcement, on the people driving 95 miles an hour, now we're going to go after people who are going 56.
On Monday, we spoke with Franco Ordonez, the McClatchy reporter who first reported on the leaked DHS memos, asking him about the policies that we're seeing now may have been foreshadowed by a memo that the now sitting Attorney General Jeff Sessions sent to the Obama administration last year.
I got a hold of this letter that you're referring to that Jeff Sessions wrote in July 2016. And it basically outlines two of those most controversial points that we were talking about earlier. Jeff Sessions, in his letter, talked about the 60% of parents the 60% of unaccompanied minors who come to the United States who eventually end up meeting with their parents who are here illegally. And he specifically questioned then Secretary Jay Johnson and then Attorney General Loretta Lynch why they were not being, quote unquote, according to them, humanely removed from the country. He also, in those letters, pointed out that their parents were subject to prosecution.
That's Franco Ordonez, the McClatchy reporter who first reported on the leaked memo last year of Sessions, who is now the Attorney General.
Yeah.
Cesar.
And see, that is the alarming part of what we're seeing with this deportation force, is that Donald Trump's style of managing has been always about, well, this is what I want, you execute it. And what we're seeing now is many staffers that used to work for Senator Jeff Sessions, Representative Bob Goodlatte, who was the chair of the Immigration Judiciary Committee, who many of them have been immigration hawks, anti-immigrant policies, are now leading a lot of this execution. And Donald Trump is just signing all these executive orders, or just signing, the DHS Secretary of Homeland Security is just signing this without really realizing what's in those things. All Donald Trump just cares about is the show. He cares about just the signing ceremony, but he doesn't really care what's in those memos, particularly because now, specifically, we're seeing that Donald Trump's recent DHS memos take away a lot of protection that families, American families, rely. For example, I have many clients who are the sons or children are in the military, spouses, but now they're not going to be able to be protected because of the possible elimination of these programs. So we are seeing now American families, military families, who are no longer going to be able to apply for this type of protection to change their immigration status.
So explain what you mean by a military family.
So, for example, there's a policy called parole in place that's discretionary, that allows the U.S. government to say, okay, you're in this country without documentation. We are going to allow you to stay here, change your immigration to become a citizen because you are the spouse or children of a U.S. service member.
So the service member could be right now in Afghanistan and Iraq.
And now we're seeing that many of these service members, whether they're Marines, Army, many of my clients tell me, I'm more afraid of my government tearing my family apart than the foreign enemy abroad. And now, see, that's exactly the alarming part that Donald Trump they cannot see, and I don't think he's going to see, because he's going to allow many of the underlings that work for Senator Jeff Sessions and many of these anti-immigration groups really leading the policy, and Donald Trump is just signing without really looking at what's in the papers.
Cesar Vargas, what about you? You yourself, you're a lawyer, you're representing immigrants who are threatened, but you yourself are threatened.
Yeah, and, I do have to have DACA, and I am what people would consider a dreamer. But I think for me, it's definitely living in a very different climate, because now my mom calls me, who is also undocumented, to make sure if I'm okay. I call her to make sure she's okay. I give her a rundown of her rights. And it is definitely alarming. It's a much more different climate of fear. And for me, we cannot let fear dictate what we're going to do in the next 4 years.
When you say you give her a rundown of her rights, what do you say if agents come knocking on your door?
Well, just as I've been doing Know Your Rights forums across the country, and particularly here in New York City at Staten Island, I give her a little card that says, Mom, you have the right to remain silent. If an immigration agent comes to the door, do not open the door. Tell them to give you the warrant, and just say, give them my number.
Will they have a warrant?
If they have, right? And I think when she doesn't know, she doesn't speak English, but I tell her, just give her my number. But she calls me all the time, making sure that I'm okay. So this is the type of atmosphere that we live in, where people without criminal records or people with minor criminal violations are really afraid and in panic. And because there's also...
And what about this issue of suspected crimes? I mean, if you're charged with a crime, that's not convicted. That's included. Of course, if you're convicted, even if you're suspected of a crime.
Yeah, and this is where we're seeing...
Yeah, it's actually...
Yes,
it's actually
Professor
worse than that. It's actually worse than that, because it's not just suspected of a crime. There's also a piece of the prioritization which says if you've misled any federal agency about anything, which means if you've been working and you've used a fake Social Security number or anything like that, you're probably, almost certainly, you're within the prioritization. So it's pretty much everybody. I mean, this is the end of prioritization. That's what we're watching. The only priorities that are staying unthreatened, and even then they are threatened, but the only ones who are not explicitly threatened by the memo are the dreamers. Everybody else is in the sights of deportation machine at this point.
And yet, Daniel Ramirez, the dreamer, the young man, 23 years old, who has DACA, in Washington State, he was imprisoned.
That's right. The administration says that if somebody does something bad, commits a crime or is a member of a gang, they're retaining the right to pull DACA away, and they say that's true for Mr. Ramirez. His lawyers say that he was that's completely false, and so they're having that argument in front of a federal court right now.
The new DHS memos explicitly state that immigrants protected under President Obama's program, DACA, as you said, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, are exempt. But these new DHS documents come on the heels of this arrest of Daniel Ramirez. And I wanted to turn to a comment. We went to Washington State to talk to people there. His arrest alarmed immigrant communities who still fear the Trump administration might target other DACA recipients. This is Paul Quinones of the Washington Dream Act Coalition.
If any of us had any doubt that Trump's regime has declared an open war, an open season on all immigrants in this country, that doubt should have evaporated by now. With Daniel's arrest, we have seen the federal government breaking its promise and shown that it cannot be trusted.
Cesar Vargas.
We are seeing agents enforcing a broken immigration system that is not able to differentiate between someone who has been living here for many years, contributing to the economy, paying taxes, and someone who is a murderer. And I think that's exactly the alarming part that we're seeing Daniel's arrest, that it's not just the violent criminals, it's the artificial creation of the good immigrant versus the bad immigrant that's entangling everyone.
You also have the situation where they say they're going to take all of these immigrants and they're going to deport them to Mexico, whether they're from Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador, to Mexico. Does this going to mean refugee camps, deportation camps in Mexico? Right now you have both Tillerson, the Secretary of State, and Kelly, the head of the Department of Homeland Security, who is going to meet with Peña Nieto. I mean, clearly President Trump couldn't meet with Peña Nieto, right? And the Mexican president canceled his meeting with Trump. Margot Schlanger, if you could respond.
Yeah, so, I mean, we'll see what happens with that plan. I mean, Mexico would have to agree to take all of these people who aren't from Mexico, who passed through Mexico to get to the United States. And I don't, my own self, understand why they would agree to that. But just suppose it did happen. It's an appalling idea. You know, the point of an immigration proceeding, the point of doing that in front of an immigration judge, is that some people have a claim to be here, and we have complicated laws where they are entitled to due process and to assert that claim and have it fairly adjudicated. If we first deport and then hold a hearing, it's a farce. The idea that hearing is actually going to be accurately able to adjudicate their status is just, it's laughable. And so what we're doing is we're giving up, we're substituting a pretense at due process for the real thing, even if Mexico agrees to take these people, and I don't see why Mexico would agree to that.
In 2014, the head of the National Council of La Raza, Janet Murguia, called President Obama the nation's deporter-in-chief.
For us, this president has been the deporter-in-chief. Any day now, this administration will reach the 2 million mark for deportations. It's a staggering number that far outstrips any of his predecessors and leaves behind it a wake of devastation for families across America. The president says his administration does not have the authority to act on his own. All we hear is no. No from Congress. No from the administration. But here's the thing. We won't take no for an answer.
So that's the head of the National Council of La Raza, Janet Murguia, calling President Obama the nation's deporter-in-chief. And Professor Schlanger, a recent McClatchy piece was headlined, "Trump doesn't need a deportation machine. Obama's already built it." You worked for President Obama. What were your thoughts at the time, and do you feel that's a fair characterization?
Well, I think that President Obama tried very hard to get Congress to sign off on comprehensive immigration reform, and that was a failed effort. And then when it became clear that that was failing, he implemented DACA. And I think DACA has been a very good step forward. He also implemented a set of practices to prioritize immigrants who were both people who were very, very recent entrants, who were really caught right at the border, and people who had committed criminal offenses. I think those were appropriate baby steps. And I think that what's needed is comprehensive immigration reform. So I think that that President Obama operated within a really constrained environment and did some really good things in it. What President Trump is doing is he's taking all of the apparatus that was built and funded and insisted on by Congress, and he is ramping it up. He is you heard it yourself from Spicer. He's unshackling the discretion of line officers, and now they can deport pretty much whoever they want. And I think that's an abdication of responsibility by the president, and just an appalling way of running an immigration system.
Yeah, I as much as we blame right now and are concerned of what Donald Trump is doing, the reality is that politics was a critical calculation in this thing. And the reality is that President Obama did deport more people than any American president. And also President Obama was reluctant to take action on DACA. And one of the things that we're seeing, for me, frankly, is that we had a president that we had to push for years. We were deeply involved in the fight to push for DACA, for stopping deportations, and it was the White House who was reluctant to protect many families, versus now we're seeing Donald Trump in his first month taking action to complete everything that he said. So, I think it's not about placing blame on President Obama. It's about holding accountable Democrats, because at the end, this is exactly what 2016 was all about. It was about the Democratic Party led by President Obama, who failed to listen to what the concerns of the American people, and people wanted immigration reform, no question about it. The real culprit here are not the American communities, are not the American people. The real culprits here are Congress, Republicans and Democrats, who failed to listen to the American people, to pass immigration reform, to take action on protecting families, to take action to protect the families, and to really ramp up the economy. What we didn't. So we just saw literally a president who played politics, both parties, and now we have a president, Donald Trump, who's just simply doing whatever he feels like on tweeting. And I think that's not how you govern this nation. So it's about holding accountable both Democrats and Republicans, because both of them must take responsibility for a broken immigration system. And now we're going to see this results play out, sadly.
At one of the many massive protests that have taken place, this one down at Battery Park, as people, thousands, marched to Federal Plaza, one of the people was holding up a sign that said, "France called, they want their statue back." I want to thank Margot Schlanger for joining us, a professor of law at the University of Michigan Law School, and Cesar Vargas. Thanks so much for being with us, co-director of Dream Action Coalition, New York State's first openly undocumented attorney. That does it for this segment. When we come back, we go to Montgomery, Alabama, and to the Anne Frank Center here in New York. Stay with us.
Chile, a Bolivari galaxy, that will be the illest. Welcome to my world, the people's universe. Let's have a conversation that'll make your soul search Earth. Mother, it feels good to say things that uplift the hood. For what it's worth, we've been here for a while. Follow the moon, take a walk for a mile in the shoes of the man that pick your fruit. I want access to schools, I don't want to join the troops. You came to my country, you brought the dictator. Gave him money and told him pay me later. So taste the tomato, whatever. The students, the farmers, working together. Pa'lante inmigrante, no a la guerra. Mundo mapuche, siempre, forever. Human being, I got feet, so I walk. If I can't eat, I'ma move till I find my piece of the...
I'm an Alien by Rebel Diaz here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. 11 Jewish community centers across the country were hit by another wave of bomb threats on Monday. It was the fourth wave of nationwide bomb threats against JCCs in the last 5 weeks. In total, 69 threats have been reported against 54 JCCs. Meanwhile, at a cemetery in University City, Missouri, the grave sites of more than 100 Jews were vandalized over the weekend. The Southern Poverty Law Center has revealed the number of anti-Muslim groups in the United States tripled last year, from 34 in 2015 to 101 last year. The Southern Poverty Law Center and other groups have said hate groups have been energized by the candidacy and then the election of Donald Trump. In recent weeks, Trump has faced increasing criticism for failing to denounce anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim threats. Well, on Tuesday, President Trump briefly addressed the recent wave of anti-Semitic threats after tremendous public outcry that he hadn't. His comments came after he toured the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C.
the anti-Semitic threats targeting our Jewish community and community centers are horrible and are painful and a very sad reminder of the work that still must be done to root out hate and prejudice and evil.
President Trump's reading of that statement came less than a week after he chastised Jewish reporter Jake Turks for asking about the recent bomb threats at President Trump's news conference.
What we are concerned about, and what we haven't really heard being addressed, is an uptick in anti-Semitism and how the government is planning to take care of it. There's been a report out that 48 bomb threats have been made against Jewish centers all across the country in the last couple of weeks. There are people who are committing anti-Semitic acts or threatening to.
You see, he said he was going to ask a very simple, easy question. And it's not. It's an important. It's not a simple question, not a fair question. Okay, sit down. I understand the rest of your question. So here's the story, folks. Number one, I am the least anti-Semitic person that you've ever seen in your entire life. Number two, racism, the least racist person. In fact, we did very well relative to other people running as a Republican. Quiet, quiet, quiet. See, he lied about he was going to get up and ask a very straight, simple question. So, it's welcome to the world of the media.
He was telling the Jewish reporter to be quiet, quiet, quiet. Well, during a separate news conference only days earlier, when he was standing with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, President Trump responded to a question from an Israeli reporter about the rise in anti-Semitic attacks by boasting about his election victory. Well, for more, we're joined by two guests. Stephen Goldstein, the executive director of the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect here in New York. The group posted a statement on Facebook. Mr. President, you're too little, too late. Acknowledgement of anti-Semitism today is not enough. And in Montgomery, Alabama, we're joined by Mark Potok. He is senior fellow at the Southern Poverty Law Center. He authored the group's year-end report, Hate Groups Increase for Second Consecutive Year as Trump Electrifies Radical Right. Stephen Goldstein and Mark Potok, welcome to Democracy Now! Stephen, let's begin with you. So you just heard that statement he read at the African American Museum. Your response?
Well, I actually thought the president lost it, if it was possible to think that he already hadn't lost it. His response was remarkable for its tin-eardom. This president said absolutely nothing over the weekend when Jewish grave sites were desecrated. He said absolutely nothing about bomb threats, and he refused even to include Jews in the Holocaust. Then all of a sudden...
You mean the World Holocaust Day?
Exactly.
He did not cite Jews as
Amy, astonishing. Then all of a sudden, he wakes up on a Tuesday, decides to give a speech, which, by the way, he read with all the sincerity of a bad method actor. And this is a president who really knows how to speak with passion when he wants to. And he expected our applause simply because he acknowledges anti-Semitism. And I have to ask, are our nation's expectations so low that our president, merely by acknowledging anti-Semitism, something other presidents have now done for decades, should receive some applause? And worse yet, his spokesperson, Sean Spicer, yesterday chastised my organization for not applauding and be grateful for the president's remarks. It's unbelievable. It was as if little crumbs of condescension were being thrown my organization's way. Remarkable tin-eardom and remarkable prejudice coming from this administration.
I want to see if we have this clip of the reporter who asked the question yesterday. This is CBS News Foreign Affairs and White House correspondent Margaret Brennan questioning White House spokesperson Sean Spicer.
Sean, I want to give you a chance to respond to something because I think that the president's remarks and your clarification about where he stands on anti-Semitism is clear. But after that statement was made by the president, the Anne Frank Center released a pretty strongly worded one, saying that these remarks, while well received, are a Band-Aid on the cancer within the Trump administration, saying that there is, whether blessed or otherwise, a sense of xenophobia within this administration.
Yeah, I think it's, look, the president has made clear since the day he was elected, and frankly going back through the campaign, that he is someone that seeks to unite this country. He has brought a diverse group of folks into his administration, both in terms of actual positions and people that he has sought the advice of. And I think he has been very forceful with his denunciation of people who seek to attack people because of their hate, because of their religion, because of their gender, because of the color of their skin. And it's something that he's going to continue to fight and make very, very clear that he has no place in this administration. But I think that it's ironic that no matter how many times he talks about this, that it's never good enough. Today, I think, was an unbelievably forceful comment by the president as far as his denunciation of the actions that are currently targeted towards Jewish community centers. But I think that he's been very clear previous to this that he wants to be someone that brings his country together and not divide people, especially in those areas. So I saw that statement. I wish that they had praised the president for his leadership in this area, and I think that hopefully as time continues to go by, they recognize his commitment to civil rights, to voting rights, to equality for all Americans.
So that was Sean Spicer at his White House press briefing. Stephen Goldstein.
That was insane. Sean Spicer is living in a parallel universe. First of all, admonishing us that we should praise the president. We're supposed to salute this president. And as far as the words of the president being good enough, who says that to an oppressed community, that our words should be good enough? They simply cannot relate to anyone who looks like themselves. And as far as this president repeatedly calling out anti-Semitism, let alone Islamophobia, racism, sexism, he never speaks about it. So I don't know what script Sean Spicer was reading from, but it was not a script from reality.
Also yesterday, our other guest's organization was raised when the CBS News Foreign Affairs White House correspondent Margaret Brennan also questioned Spicer on Tuesday.
Southern Poverty Law Center said that the number of anti-Muslim groups in the U.S. has tripled between 2015 and 2016 during the time of the campaign. Is this message within the administration, anti-Semitism is not allowed, xenophobia is not allowed, anti-Muslim sentiment within the administration, has the president been forceful about that particular issue?
Well, I think that the president, in terms of his desire to combat radical Islamic terrorism, he understands that people who want to express a peaceful position have every right in our Constitution. But if you come here or want to express views that seek to do our country or our people harm, he's going to fight it aggressively, whether it's domestic acts that are going on here or attempts through people abroad to come into this country. So there's a big difference between preventing attacks and making sure that we keep this country safe so that there is no loss of life and allowing people to express themselves in accordance with our First Amendment. Those are two very, very different things.
So that was White House spokesperson Sean Spicer. Mark Potok is with us of the Southern Poverty Law Center, speaking to us from Montgomery, Alabama. Your response, Mark?
Well, I mean, I just have to agree. These comments from Spicer, from Trump, are ludicrous in the extreme. I agree that they both seem to be living in another universe. I mean, let's get real about Trump. He's the divider in chief. This is a guy who began his campaign describing Mexican immigrants as rapists and drug dealers. And he has gone on to denounce just about every minority out there. It has just been an extraordinary thing to watch. I think that, what has happened with Trump is that when he finally gets backed into a corner by reporters or other people, he kind of says a few words, as was said by the other guest just now, with incredible insincerity about how terrible this anti-Semitism is and Islamophobia and so on. I think the truth is that Donald Trump has played footsie with the radical right from the very start of his campaign. He has studiously avoided denouncing or disavowing the extreme right again and again and again. I mean, let's remember how Trump claimed not to know who David Duke, the former Klan leader, is. Therefore, he couldn't disavow him. That was simply a falsehood, a lie, to speak plainly. He knew perfectly well who Duke was. In fact, in 2000, Trump wrote an essay in the New York Times saying why he was dropping his bid for the presidency on the Reform Party ticket, because Duke was associated with the Reform Party and Trump couldn't have anything to do with him. So this is all a word game with an awful lot of falsehoods being sprinkled around.
We're going to break. When we come back, I want to ask you about what you wrote. The radical right was more successful in entering the political mainstream last year than in half a century. We are speaking with Mark Potok of the Southern Poverty Law Center, as well as Stephen Goldstein of the Anne Frank Center here in New York. Stay with us. Yes, that music that you just heard is T5 Sweatshop Boys. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we continue with Stephen Goldstein of the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect and Mark Potok with the Southern Poverty Law Center. What you wrote, Mark, the radical right more successful in entering political mainstream last year than in half a century. Explain the findings of your report.
Well, even more than half a century. I mean, half a century ago, George Wallace made a run for the presidency in 1968, and it seemed at least imaginable at that point that the radical right would enter the mainstream, but it didn't. Of course, Wallace lost the election, and things have gone in much the other direction for most of the last 50 years. So, basically what we found in the report was that for the second straight year, the number of hate groups went up, but more important than the actual numbers, which actually are near historic highs in some 30 years of counting that we've done, is the fact that these groups are just electrified by Trump. They feel that they have a man in the White House. They feel that they have been given permission to say the things they really believe, that these are legitimate and normalized views. So really, I think the effect of Donald Trump has been to unleash a kind of Pandora's box of hatreds on our country. And those are not easy things to get back in the box. The other thing we found, the other really remarkable thing, which you mentioned already, was a near tripling in the number of anti-Muslim hate groups. And I think this is not, 100% due to Donald Trump. Certainly part of it is a response to real-life atrocities from the Islamic State and related kinds of groups, but a huge part of it is due to Trump. Trump really unleashed this with his comments about Muslims not being good enough to be in our country, with his proposal for a Muslim registry, with his idea of surveilling mosques, and on and on and on. So that essentially was our finding, that the radical right has come alive as a result of Trump. They have never felt, and in fact never been, in anyone's memory, so close to real power. They're in a position right now to actually have an effect on national policy, a remarkable thing.
Deeply moving story out of Missouri, where the Jewish cemetery, perhaps hundreds of tombstones were upended, and a Muslim group went online to raise money to help the Jewish community restore these tombstones. And they raised, I think at this point, it's over $50,000, and said they would contribute this not only to help the cemetery, but other people, now over 60,000. It's been going up by leaps and bounds, but to help Jewish groups around the country that are facing assault, Stephen.
Amy, that is the real America. And that's what Muslim Americans are like, and that's what Jewish Americans are like, and that's what all other Americans are like. People with essential goodness whom this president should not demonize. People who have greater morals than the president himself has ever had.
I wanted to go to some other news. On Tuesday, Milo Yiannopoulos resigned as Breitbart's editor. At a news conference in New York City, a reporter asked him about Trump's chief strategist, Steve Bannon, who was formerly the head of Breitbart.
What's your relationship with Steve Bannon? When was the last time you spoke to him?
Steve Bannon brought me into Breitbart. Steve Bannon is one of the most formidable and brilliant political operatives of his generation. I have nothing but admiration for the guy. Not an easy person to work for if you're a slacker. Not an easy person to work for if you don't show up to work or if you don't really give everything your all. Fortunately, I'm not one of those people. I haven't spoken to Steve for a very long time, since before he took the job at the White House.
Do you credit him discovering you, though? Do you credit him as discovering you? I think you said something to that.
Yeah, Steve Bannon, has populated Breitbart with, a disproportionately Jewish ethnic minority and gay senior editorial team. And we are, we were, I should say, far more diverse than any of the people criticizing Breitbart for alleged racism or God knows what it is today.
That was Milo Yiannopoulos, who's just resigned from Breitbart under allegations that he supported pedophilia. Mark Potok, the significance of Breitbart now represented in the White House, although Steve Bannon, of course, has supposedly left Breitbart for the time being.
Well, I mean, Steve Bannon is the person that the extreme right feels is their man in the White House, and they are not wrong. As far as the Milo Yiannopoulos escapade, I think it shows that much like Donald Trump himself, Milo Yiannopoulos was a bit of an unexploded grenade. This was bound to happen. This is the man who is so, quote unquote, politically incorrect that he is willing to say things, forget political correctness, that are outrageous and really awful. So, I think that we've seen what happened with Yiannopoulos. He basically imploded. He's lost his book contract. He's lost his work. And hopefully we won't have to hear too much more about him. Unfortunately, that's not the case with Donald Trump. He's the same kind of character, this sort of explosive character. You don't know what's coming next. And one thing that is certain, though, is that Donald Trump is certainly not the uniter-in-chief, as he claims. He's quite the opposite.
Stephen Goldstein, if you could talk about the story of Anne Frank in terms of immigration to the United States.
Well, Amy, here's what's so frightening. Anne Frank was denied immigration at least twice. Otto Frank, her father, appealed to the Roosevelt administration.
This was FDR?
Yes, this was FDR. Roughly between the periods of 1939 to 1941. Otto Frank was actually a fairly well-connected man. He was an intelligent man with friends in high places, and he was able to get communications very high up in the Roosevelt administration saying, please, save my family, save the Frank family. It didn't work. FDR refused Refugee and Frank. So for those of us in the Jewish community, and for those of us who are not Jewish, but who simply care about never again repeating what happened to Anne Frank, when we look at the Muslim ban and we look at Syrian refugees, we say, let us save every future Anne Frank that we didn't save decades ago. And whether this kind of evil prejudice against refugees was perpetrated by a Democrat like Franklin Roosevelt or a Republican like Donald Trump, it is an unconscionable blot on the American national conscience. That's why, in the name of Anne Frank, we have an obligation to stand with Muslim refugees and to stand with all refugees to help them come into this nation.
A Texas mosque was just burned to the ground, Mark Potok, and the Jewish synagogue said our building is big enough for both and handed the keys over of their synagogue to the Muslims in the community. Your final comment. What do you think, Mark Potok, President Trump could do to show that he's serious about stopping these hate groups?
Well, I think he can't do much because the fact is that he is not serious about stopping them. The reality is he has stood by and said nothing, while not merely one, but 3 different mosques were burned to the ground in the month of January alone. That is the really remarkable thing. So I think that we are put in a position, we sort of the people of this country, of building intercommunal ties between Jews and Muslims and so on. And
we'll have to leave it there. Mark Potok and Stephen Goldstein, thanks so much for joining us. I'm Amy Goodman.